Welcome to your third set of worm video notes. These notes are going to focus on phylum Annelida, or the segmented worms. So if we look at our chart here, Annelida, these are the most advanced types of worms, and there are once again still a parasitic kind and a free-living kind. So leeches and earthworms are the two most common ones we think about. And they're also coelomate, so we really don't use the term eucoelomate anymore, so they are coelomate worms. So some general characteristics. So these worms can be terrestrial, marine, or freshwater, but the important thing to note is that they have repeating segments, and they can be they're triploblastic again, but these are those true coelomates. They have a complete gut system. They also have a closed circulatory system, respiratory organs, protostome development, and that segmentation we talked about, which you'll also hear sometimes referred to as metamerism. So some traits. So ancestral traits, like we said, they're coelomate, they're lophotrochozoan, meaning they don't molt, they're protostome development, closed circulatory system, and cephalization, which is that concentration of nerve endings near the head. Some of their more derived traits are things like segmentation, setae, which are these little bristles, and you can see that in the picture below, and then myelinated neurons. So let's talk about their body systems, and there's two slides of systems we're going to talk about. So the first slide talks about these four. So the integumentary is the epidermis. This is a one-cell layer. It has a mucus gland, and this secretes a moist cuticle for the worm. Their skeletal system, they don't have bones like we tend to think of with a skeletal system, but they have a hydrostatic skeletal system, and they use their coelom for this. Muscular, they have two types of muscles, longitudinal and circular muscles, and these are independent of each segment. The muscles in each segment are independent. Their digestive system, like we said, is complete and complex, and you'll see that when we dissect these in class. Some other body systems you need to know about. So the excretory, they have a pair of nephridia per segment. This should be a common phrase that you're used to from the other types of worms. Their respiratory system, they actually breathe through their skin, and some of them can use parapodia, or tube worms do have gills. Their circulatory system is closed. They use hemoglobin as their oxygen carrier. And then their nervous system, they do have a dorsal brain and a solid nerve cord. They also have ganglia that are in each segment. The endocrine system has hormones, and reproductive, it depends on the type of worm, so they can either be dioecious or monoecious depending on their class. Here's a look at the phylogeny. So if you look, we go from least advanced to most advanced. So the leeches up here are the most advanced segmented worms, and you can see earthworms here are kind of a little bit lower on this ancestral trait. Here's a look at just the general body plan. You might want to pause the slide and either take a picture or screenshot this. That way you have it for your notes and when we do dissections. So we're going to get into the classes now. So class Polychaeta. So these are the most numerous number in species, and they live in a marine habitat. What's unique about these ones is they have highly specialized head regions because they live in tubes. So because they're tube dwelling, their head needs to have all their sensory organs, and the rest of their body isn't as important in that aspect. So they have antennas, these sensory palps, and feeding appendages all in this head region. They also have these paired fleshy extensions called parapodia, which we'll look at in just a minute. So here's a look at the external anatomy. As you can see, the parapodia are here on the sides, which I mentioned. We have the palps are here, some tentacles. You can see their advanced jaws. This is all going to help them be successful while living in a tube and still coming out to feed. Here's a look at just some of the diversity. So this is one type. As you can see, it's in a tube, so it's below ground. And this is the part that comes above, and this one has gills. Here's another example. So we have, these ones look a little feathery, but they're in the tube, their mouth is here, and then they have all of these to help with water flow through and helping them feed. And here's a look at just the tube and how they kind of live in that tube. And here's a better example. It shows the mouth of the worm. The water's moving in this way, but the worm's going to go up this way to feed. And here's just kind of some examples of some real versions of those. Here's another example of the diversity of these worms, and these ones have these little plumes at the top. These are ones you typically see at the bottom of the ocean. They're going to be down there. That's where they feed. So when you talk about this class, we're going to talk about the reproduction because it's a little bit different from what you may think of in terms of an earthworm. So they're dioecious, and they have something called a trochophore larva. So this is a little cylindrical kind of larva, and it has all these cilia, you can see them on there, and it spins, and that's how it moves. Some of them also develop these specialized segments that have gametes, and they're called epitokes. And if you see each one of these little dots is all an epitoke, you could count forever and count all of those. And those segments actually get released, and that's when the gametes burst out, and that's for its reproduction. During asexual reproduction, these epitokes, they don't burst, they essentially become buds, and they bud off new worms. This also gives us some clues to the ancestral origin of segmentation, because maybe segmentation came from these buds that didn't actually completely break off from the parent worm. When we compare polychaetes with oligochaetes, so there's some differences in several ways. So oligochaetes don't have parapodia, or those little fleshy extensions. They have fewer setae, if any at all, and they're hermaphroditic. So these sex cells they do have, they're produced in separate sections, which still allows for sexual reproduction. And they don't have a larval stage. A couple do, but most of them do not. In terms of characteristics, so they have this defined glandular region called the clitellum. This will be very obvious when we do our dissections in class, and I'm sure if you think about an earthworm, you can think about this part. And they also have few bristles. They're really not going to have as many bristles as the previous worms we discussed. And like we said, most are earthworms, although there are a few that are marine. For their development, the terrestrial species, like we discussed, do not have a larval form, but some aquatic species have that trochophore-like larval stage with that little spinning cilia larva. When we look at the external anatomy, once again, you can see the clitellum here, the little spots where they have setae on their body. The anus is at this end, and then the mouth is at this end. Internal anatomy, this is super important. So at some point, you are going to have to trace the direction of food when it enters an earthworm. So we start with the mouth, and then it's going to go through here. It goes through here, keeps going into the intestine. So if I were you, I'd pause this video, I'd either screenshot this or take a picture or draw it in your notes, but this will be very important when we get to earthworm dissection. For the reproduction, earthworms, like I said, they mate sexually, and this is a kind of live picture here showing it in real life, but we have a sketch here that shows it a little bit better. So they're going to line up, and then they're going to exchange sperm between the earthworms. So as a result, those eggs are in here, and they're in something called a slime tube. The slime tube is going to ultimately house the eggs and turn into a cocoon, where those fertilized eggs are going to grow, and eventually worms will emerge. Here's just a closer look at your dissection pictures. So this is another great slide for you to screenshot or take a picture of, because this will come in handy, especially when you have to know these parts during your dissection. And like I mentioned, there are a few marine species. As you can see, these examples are very different from the earthworms that we typically think of for this class. So the final thing we're going to talk about is subclass Hirundinea, and these have a fixed number of segments. This makes them different from other types of segmented worms. They don't have setae or parapodia, and they have a sucker. It's on their posterior end, but they also have another sucker on the other end, which I'll show you in a minute. They are predominantly freshwater, but they can live in seas or most soil, and they do not burrow or crawl. They actually move similar to this over here. So you see it numbered. They move using that sucker, and that's how they reach and move instead of burrowing or crawling like we're used to with other worms. So here's a look at the internal anatomy. So posterior sucker, you can see that's there, but there also is an anterior sucker, which is where the mouth is, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But you can see they do have a crop, and they have the intestine. They also have male and female parts in their bodies. So the anterior sucker, like I mentioned, it's small and has the mouth, and this is where leeches are known for, because this mouth is going to create a wound with their saw-like jaws, and this is how they drink the blood of other animals, and it's usually vertebrates. They can be carnivores or scavengers, and they're really not set in their feeding habits, but blood is what they definitely prefer. Here's just a closer look at a leech on someone, pretty gross. And blood sucking in general. So these salivary glands in leeches excrete hirudin, which prevents the blood from coagulating or clotting. It also can secrete an anesthetic which dilates smaller blood vessels. This blood is then broken down by these symbiotic bacteria, and then it's used by the leeches. And kind of a fun fact here, leeches were commonly used during the 19th century for bloodletting. They are still used currently, but a little bit different. So they're used to relieve pressure after damage of vascular tissue, snake bites, or even if you're trying to reattach a finger or a toe or an ear. And their reproduction, so they're simultaneous hermaphrodites, and they don't have a free-living larval stage, just like the earthworms. They do internal fertilization, however, and they do that through copulation. And they do develop in a cocoon, which is similar to the earthworms that we discussed. And that is all for your notes.